And we're back.
Okay, good morning. If you're in Europe and the UK and you're just getting online, welcome to ID24. We're just about to welcome Shadi-Abou-Zahra from W3C. Shadi is the activity program lead for the Web Accessibility Initiatives International Program Office. And today he's going to be talking about ways you can get started with accessibility, or if you've already made that jump into accessibility, how you can help other people take those first few steps. And he's going to be looking at some different resources from the W3C to help you do that. As always, if you've got any questions, then please tweet us with the hashtag ID24. We'll keep a lookout for those and ask Shadi your questions at the end of his talk. And so, Shadi, on that note, it's over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Welcome from Vienna, Austria, in the heart of Europe. So, yeah, thank you for the introduction, Lenny. Today I'd like to give you a walkthrough through some of the resources, some of the very recent ones that we've just released, resources mainly on different aspects of accessibility, education, and outreach. So be it if you're more technical or if you're less technical, if you're new to accessibility or if you've been here for a while, to help really spread the word, spread the knowledge, because I think one of the biggest issues of accessibility is that people either don't know about it or don't have the skills to actually do something about it. So let me switch to the slides. I hope this works. Start screen share. So I hope you should be seeing my screen now. And so, yeah, these slides are available online if you want. I will be reading out the URLs as we go through. So it's really just a bunch of links, so you don't really need the slides. But if you want to follow, it's on tinyurl.com/GAD 2016, one word, hyphen or dash SAZ for my initials. So it's tinyurl.com/GAD GAAD 2016 -SAZ. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started with getting started. And as promised, this walkthrough through some of the resources. And really, the very first thing with getting started is getting started. So many years ago, with WCAG 1, there were those quick tips for accessibility. They felt they fit well on a business card format. It was just 10 tips to get accessibility, and it was something to pass around, and people really loved it. It was easy to share, easy to give, and to give people an idea of how to get started. With accessibility, it was things like, you know, add headings, add alt attribute at the time, and with WCAG 2, we kind of didn't have this for a while, just recently, a few months ago, meanwhile, I think it was in January or February, we released those getting started tips with web accessibility, or tips for getting started with web accessibility. And the idea here is, again, to just provide a collection of pointers. People, especially at the beginning, feel overwhelmed. There's this big WCAG and all those other guidelines and technologies, and it's kind of difficult to get into it, and some people kind of give up already at that stage because they just feel so overwhelmed. Whereas we wanted to really communicate with this: hey, you can get started. They're really simple things that you can get started with right away, things that you can do easily regardless of your role. So we try to have this a bit more role-based. So we have a collection of tips for designing, and the address, if you want to look at this resource, is w3.org/WAI/getting started. And that's also one word, /tips. So w3.org/way getting started tips will get you to this resource. And as I said, it's role-based, so we have a bunch of resources for a bunch of tips for designers. If you're designing for accessibility, things like provide sufficient color contrast, don't use color alone, those kind of tips. And for each one of them, it provides you with examples, with real examples. So it's a short piece of text. What does it mean not to use color alone to convey information? And then an example, in this case, there's a form, and using the famous red color alone to communicate the required fields and what you can do about it. And also, going back again, for authors, for writers of web content who are very often non-technical people, but the majority of content really that is being published by non-technical people who are just using their content management systems or whatever tools to put a lot of information, a lot of content online. And also those audiences need to consider accessibility. So here's also a collection of tips for those people. And it's loading a little bit slowly. Not sure what's going on. So those are things like provide informative, unique titles, use headings to convey meaning. And again, here with each one, it should be easily digestible. So in this case, it's really just a two-sentence paragraph. What does it mean to use headings to convey meanings? And then example to visualize that, to really show what we mean by using headings and the corresponding requirements in WCAG if people want to dig deeper, but really it's already sufficient to stay at this level. And the third batch that we have is developing. So this is much more for the developers. This looks at the JavaScript and in the interaction aspects and so on. So these collections of tips I think are really ideal for people who are getting started in your team or in your colleagues, if you know of, or if you yourself are just getting started with accessibility, go there first, and you can get things done right away without too much delay. We are hoping to extend these, for example, for accessibility evaluators, if you want to get into evaluations, for advocacy, you know, getting started with advocating for accessibility or for managing accessibility projects. So we have ideas here of extending those startup tips, as we call them. The next resource that I'd like to also show to you, it used to be called Preliminary Review, which was really a cursory check for accessibility, and now we've called it Easy Checks. A first review of accessibility, and this is also geared to people who are very, very new to accessibility, and also non-technical people. So this can be done by most audiences, and it provides tips on, or actually steps, easy steps on evaluating simple things in accessibility, like the page title of the content, the text alternative for images, the headings, the contrast ratio, things that people could do themselves. And of course, this is not a full accessibility evaluation. This is just a cursory review to get an idea. So the idea here is, if you are starting with accessibility, you hear about accessibility, and you have no idea how is your website doing, with this resource, you can actually check for yourself. So here's how to check for the page title. It provides you specific steps, specific guidance, what to look for, what to do, what to check, and additional tips related to that you can expand and read more. How, you know, best practices and how titles should be done or should not be done. How to check that in different kinds of browsers. So it should be something that everybody could follow, regardless if you're technical or not, and how much expertise you have in accessibility. And it should, if you follow those steps for any web page on your site, you should get an impression. You know, did most of those issues, you know, do you have a lot of those issues occurring? That's probably an indicator that even if you do a a more rigorous testing, that will also be the situation. Sorry, I didn't read out the address for that resource. So it's w3.org/wai/eval, EVAL/preliminary. So that's the address for this resource that you can take a look, and again, to pass on if you yourself are already beyond that stage. Yeah, let's move on to another resource that I think also fairly early on. So now you kind of got an idea. You started to do do the basic steps of adding some text alternatives and headings and using colors and so on, and you started to to check your site and see if you have if you're using images correctly and so on. So you're kind of getting into the nuts and bolts already, and getting into the weeds. But really, accessibility is about people, and that's one thing that we really try to communicate over and over. The guidelines and the standards are extremely important, because that's kind of what you're trying to conform to, that's what you're trying to achieve, that's the guidance to help you make the website accessible, but it's really about the people. So there's a resource called How People with Disabilities Use the Web, which provides an overview for that, and the address of that is w3.org/way/people-use-web. So people use web. And the full title of that is called How People with Disabilities Use the Web. And it's actually a multi-page resource. So it's a collection of resources to, for those who want to read, for a longer read. But at some point, I think towards the beginning, if you really want to learn about accessibility, you should try to really learn about the real people behind that, and ideally actually bringing in some people at some point. But before you bring in real people and deal with that, it might be good to just read about some of the things and get your information up to date. So the first page in this resource is called Stories of Web User, and it's a collection of I think it's what, 9 different fictional people that we made up, but they are realistic. So it is actually, I think with each of these people, I can actually see real people behind that. So they are inspired by real people in many of those situations, and it just describes their stories and what accessibility options and adaptive strategies they use in order to interact with the web. So for example, the first is Mr. Lee, an online shopper with color blindness, and you can read about Mr. Lee and what he does. He wants to buy some new clothes, so it does go into a fair amount of detail about that person, about the persona. And then there are other sections in the resource that that pick up from that story. So for instance, there is about color blindness. You can switch to another section and read actually about color blindness. What is color blindness in the first place? Customized fonts and colors, this concept of adaptive strategy of colors and fonts, but also the accessibility principles behind this, to make sure that content can be presented in different ways and content is easier to see and hear. We'll get into those pages. So you start off with a story of a real person, and then you can dig more into actually into further parts of this resource and learn more about the background. So what are those other parts of this resource? We have the second page is called Diversity of Web Users, and here this is maybe a bit more it introduces really the disabilities, just the terminology here for people to understand. So, for instance, auditory disabilities. What is auditory disabilities? Here, demystifying the aspect that auditory disabilities automatically means deafness. What does it mean, hard of hearing, and what issues relate to that? So again, here you have more detail about the needs, some examples of auditory disabilities. Also, not to forget deaf, blind people in this case as well. They also have accommodation needs for similar to deafness. The examples of barriers, what kind of barriers people with auditory disabilities may encounter. So it really goes into more the terminology of disability to give people a background. Again, we should not forget that a lot of people haven't heard of or don't know much about disability in the context of accessibility, and so giving them a bit of that background is quite important. Okay, the third page is called Diversity in Web Use, and this talks much more about the assistive technologies and adaptive strategies that people use. So some of the tools and preferences, but it's again also adaptive strategies. So it's not only assistive technologies, while of course a lot of the accessibility requirements are very related to assistive technology. We also wanted to communicate about a lot of the needs for being able to use the website without assistive technologies, and that many people people with disabilities do not use assistive technologies. Things about content formats, hearing, seeing, and feeling. So that's much more about the transformation between the different types. So auditory, being able to perceive information in an auditory form or in a tactile form, like Braille, or vibration, meanwhile, on mobile, visual information. So those different kind of formats, the really basic formats of information, and the presentation of the information, making it distinguishable and understandable, and the interaction aspects. So here's where keyboard aspects come in, also touchscreen aspects, and so on. So the last resource of this is the accessibility principles, and actually this is a little bit unfortunate. It's a little bit hidden in there, and we are looking at maybe bringing that up into a standalone page, because some people feel that this is really a nice summary of actually all the guidelines. So this is organized using the WCAG organization, the perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. But it talks about those concepts more generically, and links actually to all other resources. So, for example, when it talks about text alternatives for non-text content under perceivable information, it of course links to the WCAG requirement, guideline 1.1, but it also links to UAG. And for those who actually spot, it's still on UAG 1.0, so we want to update that to the later versions of the guidelines that we meanwhile have. And so it links here also to the guidelines of UAG that relate to that requirement or that principle, and also the authoring tool accessibility guidelines. I should maybe spell out UAG, the user agent accessibility guidelines. Those are the guidelines for web browsers and media players, and also for a lot of the mobile apps. And then it links back again to sections. So if you're reading about a principle, like here, text alternatives, you can actually go back and see which stories relate to that, that require text, that relate to text alternative. which types of disabilities. So all this resource is really heavily interlinked back and forth between each other, and the idea here is to give you a solid information about accessibility and disabilities and how people with disabilities actually use the web. Okay, let's move on then and look at the next resource, which is much more actually targeted at the more project leader or project manager level to look at how to integrate accessibility into the production process. You know, we always say that accessibility needs to be considered early on and throughout. And so the address for this resource is w3.org/wai/IMPL. So that's short for implementation, IMPL. And if you go there, you should find this resource, and it's organized according to you know, the basic project management phases of initiate, plan, implement, and sustain beyond the project. And under each of those categories, there are tasks, things that you could do in these phases. And you know, we needed some organization, but we also wanted to communicate really that it's not a waterfall model. And very often you might actually have several things. So for instance, under initiate is learn the basics. This is really one of the very early steps is to learn the basic. But you might already have from the plan category, you know, a review of the website. You know, you got a review from somewhere, and that's what actually kicked off accessibility. So you might have different bits and pieces of this plan already accomplished, and also depending on your own production process and your type of organization and skills, some of those aspects might be more relevant or less relevant. So again, under each of these categories, initiate are the steps here to do, like for initiate, you know, before you initiate the accessibility or while you're initiating, you know, learning the basic, really understanding, exploring the current environment. How does it look at my organization in the first place, or the website that I'm dealing with? Setting objectives. What do we actually want to do? And so on. The business case that also belongs in the initiate phase to actually think about, okay, you know, putting the right budgets in order to create that. Yeah, I'm not going to run through all the sections, but in the plan, for instance, in the planning, you start creating an accessibility policies, you start assigning the responsibilities in the organization, you develop a more robust budget and resource plan. And again, all this is going to correspond probably to the usual website development plan or project development plan, but those are guidances here to include accessibility into this overall project plan and throughout, really. Right. So far, it's been fairly basic. So just to recap, we started off with the tips, with the quick tips to get people right away, then with the easy checks to get some early checking, some background reading and how people with disabilities use the web, and this is more geared to managers. But of course, a big focus is on developers, and I think developers and designers like to actually see things in practice. And one of the resources that we also have, which is more practical, and actually this is also useful for people who are non-technical themselves and just want to see a real example of what does accessibility mean. So we have a resource that meanwhile is also showing some signs of age, called the Before and After Demo, or for short, BAD. I love that acronym. So the address is w3.org/wai/demos/bad, BAD. That is the address for the before and after demonstration. And what it is really, it's a miniature website of just 4 pages: a home page, a news page, a tickets, and a survey page, including the template that they were used to create. And each of those pages is available in an accessible version and inaccessible version. So again, the design is a little bit older, and we actually are going to be updated. We will be updating this resource in the near future. So I'm really looking forward to having the updated design to make it more current. But the idea here is that the before and the after look more or less the same. And this is to communicate that an accessible website doesn't have to be dull and boring. Accessibility is built in under the hood, and if it's considered from the start, you can create just as equally attractive or unattractive, in this case, websites that include accessibility. So it's not the accessibility that makes it more or less attractive. Really, the design should not matter. And what I really love about this also is each page also has annotations, so-called annotations. So you could switch on those annotations, and you could highlight specific sections. So on the left-hand side, there are numbers, markers, and if you click on those, there's an overlay pop-up box that talks to you about what is here, what was here the fix. So this is because we are on the accessible one. If we actually switch to the inaccessible version of that and look at the same pop-up, we actually see the issue. We see the problem. What's actually the problem here? It's being highlighted. So it shows you the piece of the code. It tells you the issue and the corresponding WCAG criteria that it did not meet. And again, as I said, if you switch to the accessible version, you can then see what the correct code is and which technique was used to actually repair that. So this is a very practical, hands-on, to actually see accessibility in action. See these. We try to present as many of the accessibility requirements as possible. There's also with each of those pages an accessibility report to actually see the full listing of the results for this page, the accessibility performance. You can actually compare your own evaluation. You can actually get students to maybe, if you're training students up, you can actually get them to maybe, find issues and then compare that to the report themselves. So we tried to show a nice broad collection of different accessibility requirements in those different pages, packaged in different ways. So the news page is much more text-based. So the issues relating here to text and organization and headings and so on, reading order. The tickets page has tables, and the issue with such tabular information. And the survey page has a form. So here the issues relating to forms. So that's really the before and after demo. As I said, we are in the process of updating that, primarily the visual design, also mobile. We'd also like to add maybe some more of the scripting and interactive aspects and ARIA. At the time, ARIA was still very early in its development. So unfortunately, that demo currently still does not have ARIA stuff. So moving on really here from the developers, so now you've actually seen accessibility in action. One of the things that you are trying to meet is the web content accessibility guidelines, is conformance to WCAG. Again, of course, the focus is on people, but this is the standard that most of us are trying to achieve. Now, WCAG during its design was really designed in a way to be to have multiple views, as the group called it back then. So the idea was WCAG is a fairly small document, but it has a lot of additional guiding materials, supplementary materials around it, the techniques and the understanding content, and really together that makes a lot of information. But the idea is really, how do you present that information? And early on already, the WCAG, when they published WCAG 2.0, the working group had published also with it a quick reference guide called How to Meet WCAG 2. And the address for that is www.org/WAI/WCAG20/quickref, one word. So quickref for quick reference. But it was a much more static kind of form where you fill in, okay, which techniques, which conformance level are you trying to achieve, and you click submit, and then you get a customized aspect of the WCAG requirements. So you get really a cut down. And so we went further and this has been just recently released, I think maybe a month ago or something. And this work was funded by an EC project, European Commission project, to update that quick reference. So we've made it much more interactive now, and also roles based. So there's the left navigation has the contents of the WCAG success criteria they can click through, but there's also a filter tab where you can have different filtering aspects. So you can look at tags, for instance, for developing or for interaction design or for visual design. And you can also say, okay, I only want to look at requirements for visual design. And what this does, what you don't see right away, is it also filters the techniques below that. So it selects really just the techniques that relate to visual design when you do that. There are also tags, like I'm developing a carousel or captions, all the requirements relating to captions. Let's try that out. So click on captions and everything gets filtered down. One of the things we noticed actually, is how often, of course, success criteria 1.1.1, so it's not very evident to see the amount of stuff that changes below, further down in the page, but it really cuts down. So here we've selected captions, and all the requirements that are shown are the non-text content 1.1.1, the stuff for audiovisual, so the time-based guideline 1.2, the requirements under that, and that's really it. Everything else is kind of hidden, is filtered out, and so you can customize that presentation and basically hand that over. There's a share button which will give you the URL, including the parameters of the URL, which you can just copy and then give to the developer or whoever's working on this, or the visual designer, and just say, okay, here are the requirements that you need to follow, including the selection of techniques pre-filtered already according to those requirements. Yeah, and you can continue. So this is from the previous version already. Of course, which level of conformance you're trying to achieve, which technologies you're using, and it will also filter down. So here, if I remove, what was this, captions? No, let's not remove smile, but actually let's do just for the sake of seeing the difference. So I removed HTML here and removed all the techniques relating to HTML. So it really gives you a much more customized view on the requirements that are needed depending on what task you're trying to perform. So you can really have this, and you can create a bookmark or something for the different project. Actually, we still have a link to the old version in case we thought maybe some people are still working on a project or something, and they might get a bit concerned if suddenly it changes. So here is the old version if you're curious, or if you haven't seen it before, and this is how it looked really. So here was a form that you, on the right hand side, that you select and then press. Anyway, let's move on because time is drawing close. Another resource for developers is the accessibility tutorials. So those tutorials on different subjects, and here we are also looking at expanding these. We do have a couple of more topics in the pipeline that will be coming. So we have, for instance, when we first started this with the tutorials, we wanted to cover also more advanced aspects. Like here is a tutorial on building carousels, and it talks about the structure and the functionality, the animation. So really step by step kind of building up the carousel and explaining the concepts as it's doing that. And we want to do also more advanced stuff. We have another tutorial on menus, for instance, all sorts of different menus. And again, here it talks about the structure, the basic structure, the styling of the menus, flyout menus, and other aspects, web application menus. So, but we also felt at the same time that a lot of the accessibility issues and barriers that we see are also very, very basic stuff. So we do have a tutorial also on images, for example, the famous text alternative. And it is still, a big issue on the web. It's far from solved. The same with tables and forms. So and actually, I really like the forms one. It has talks also about form instructions and validating with HTML5 and different aspects there. So beyond just the basic labeling and grouping that already exists. So those tutorials are sometimes go from the very basics, like adding a label, all the way to custom controls and more advanced aspects of that. So the address for that is w3.org/wai/tutorials, and here again, to get people more really deeper. And as I mentioned earlier, another resource is really that accessibility is about people, and we shouldn't forget that. Again, we keep diving into the guidelines and into technology and into all those technical stuff, but every now and then we should really just make sure that we all understand that this is about the people behind it, that all the stuff needs to work in practice. And there are a number of talks today from colleagues on ID24 that talk about these aspects, or talked already about these aspects, and I think that's incredibly important. So we have a resource called Involving Users in Web Projects for Better, Easier Accessibility. The address is w3.org/wai/users/involving. And it talks about involving users really from the very beginning and how effective this is to learn about the potential issues or real issues, to learn from the users, to develop solutions that are more effective rather than having to retrofit at the end. There is a companion resource called Including Users in Evaluation, which talks more about the testing aspect with the users. And actually, that's what we started with, but we felt that this is a bit late in the game. We really wanted to communicate that you need to involve users from much earlier on, as soon as possible, to really already get a lot of the requirements and a lot of the ideas. Yeah, I need to move on because there's a cutoff, and so last but not least really is a resource that we've just released on Tuesday, 2 days ago, called Web Accessibility Perspectives. The address for that is w3.org/wai/perspectives, and this is actually videos, so in video format, and so this is great for introductory stuff. So I'm trying to make the loop back after having started off with easy tips and gotten all the way into nitty-gritty of WCAG, quick reference and customizing WCAG, into something that again is for beginners, but really helps as a very good entry point, regardless of your knowledge level. So there are 10 videos at this stage, and they're really short videos that talk about different aspects like keyboard compatibility, but also customizable text or voice recognition and the importance of that, and video captions. And for each of these, for instance, notifications and feedback, if we go to that page, there is a video, but what's really what I want to point you to is after that video, there is explanation. What is notification and feedback? Who depends on this? The additional benefits. We really want to communicate here that accessibility does have business advantages as well, and it's it's not only the cost that people keep asking. How much will this cost me? But really, what are the advantages of doing that as well? And last, if you scroll further down, there's a learn more section that will actually point you to all those resources that we were talking about earlier on. So to the accessibility principles here for notifications and feedback, the getting started tips that relate to this, the easy checks that you can do, the user stories from how people with disabilities use the web, and including the WCAG 2 already pre-customized. So if you click that link, it will show you all the success criteria relating to errors. So we'll already do the pre-filtering for you. So I hope the Web Accessibility Perspectives videos is a good resource to either help you get started if you're new to accessibility, or to pass on to others to help them get started and learn about all those resources that we showed today. Yeah, there's a collection of all the resources that we just covered. So that was a long walk through. And again, the slides are available at tinyurl.com/GAD 2016-SAZ. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Shadi. That was incredibly useful, absolutely jam-packed full of resources. You guys over at the Web Accessibility Initiative are busy people. I think probably one of the most successful things that I'm aware of that you've spoken about is the before and after examples, because I really think, as you were saying, they're able to kind of concretely demonstrate what an impact accessibility has and what a difference it makes. It sounds like that's something you're planning to do some kind of more work on in the future. Is that?
Yes, exactly. We're looking at updating the design for this, getting some more mobile aspects, ARIA aspects, so really getting it brushed up and up to date. Yeah.
And what, in your sort of opinion, are the kind of the really exciting projects that you've got coming up, or you're continuing to work on at W3C? You've obviously mentioned a few, but is there anything that's really got you particularly, enthusiastic?
Yeah, so last week the Education Outreach Working Group was meeting, and one of the big things really coming up is redesign of the way website, and I think that's going to be really important. We have so much information, and it's we know that it's difficult to find. The website has shown age, so I think that's really going to be incredibly important. So I myself, I'm also looking a lot into conformance testing and evaluation in the next while. So there's a lot of the work in auto WCAG that we hope we might be able to really pick up and get more mature. But so there are lots of exciting things coming up.
Yep, absolutely. And it looks like, conformance and how the tools we use are able to measure conformance with WCAG is going to be one of the kind of the big topics probably over the next sort of 12 to 18 months by the looks of things. Is that right?
Yeah, we hope so. I mean, currently we're still exploring that, but there has been really good discussion in the auto WCAG group. Actually, later today we have another meeting of that group, and there are lots of interest here from different organizations who say, we really want to get this standardized. We want to get tools, but not only tools, but the actual procedure of evaluating more consistent, because right now we have people who test in different ways and come up with different results, and that's creating a real mess in accessibility when you have confusing situation. One person says it conforms and the other person says it doesn't. So we're trying to look at that aspect.
Do you think an element of that is needing to tighten up on some of the WCAG success criteria themselves? Does the work begin there, or is that too much of a leading question for this time of the morning?
Yeah, well, everything needs to develop together, so yeah, for sure, and as you're well aware, in the WCAG group, there's already quite a bit of discussion about extensions or 2.1 and
right.
and sharpening some of the things, particularly relating to touchscreen and so on. But still, there has always been, I think, a need for more robust evaluation, and I think we've been looking at that. And WCAG 2 made a great leap from WCAG 1 in terms of testability.
Yes.
But yeah, I think it's also a sign of how accessibility is becoming more and more deployed. That people are now asking, hey, we need more consistent approaches here.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And just one last thing, I know particularly within the education and outreach, you're always looking for people to get involved and come and help with the work that WAY is doing. Is there an easy way for people to get in touch or to find out more about how they can get involved with the work you're doing over there?
Yeah, for sure. And not only the Education Outreach Working Group, we really welcome participation in all aspects of accessibility. So there are a number of different groups. If you're more technical, there's the Accessible Platform Architectures group that cross-reviews other W3C technologies as they're emerging, and in light of Internet of Things and all those evolving technologies. So best, I think, you can contact me right away. So the email address is Shadi, SHADI at w3.org. Drop me an email and I will point you to the right person who's responsible for what you're interested in.
That sounds great and brilliant. Thank you once again, Shadi, for all that fantastic information. This is Hans and I now signing off for the end of our hosted block. Up with you on the hour next will be our TPG colleagues Graham Coleman and Ian Pouncey, and they will be taking care of business through the next 3 or 4 hours of ID24. So we'll be back in just a few minutes at the top of the hour.
Thanks, Shadi. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.